You did some conferences out here, didn't you?
Yeah, I was teaching with MMA, Mind Medicine Australia, on their psychedelic therapist training course, and I did a couple of different courses with them in 2022 and 2023, I think. So back and forth quite a few times. Perth, Canberra, Sydney, Melbourne. Um, yeah, that was good fun. Had some good times there.
Nice. How is that spread working at the moment? Because I know it's still a very new field, combining the two, and it's a lot of people have a lot of apprehension with the field, taken to a more scientific standpoint. How is that spread taking on over the world? Because I know America's and the US is quite prominent and eager. A lot of people are at the moment. The UK seems to lag a little bit behind, and the same with Australia at times. But you kind of
Yeah.
helped to pioneer the whole field in its own right.
Well, one of the frustrating things about psychedelic research is the massive inequality and lack of parity around the world in terms of who can do what and where. Um, we're in the position at the moment that MDMA and psilocybin are still not licensed anywhere in the world except Australia. So, although there's all sorts of different fantastic research going on all over the world with all kinds of compounds, the only psychedelic chemical that's fully licensed and available is ketamine at the moment. Um, and of course, we have this huge explosion of ketamine assisted psychotherapy services all over the world, particularly in America and Canada and Europe and Australia, I gather. Um, and it's kind of strange that ketamine has sort of risen to the fore as the sort of primary or only psychedelic agent, because for most of us who work with all of them, it's by far not the best. It's useful, isn't it? It has its place, but it's no MDMA, it's no psilocybin. Yet it's ironically the only one we've got. I think that this is causing a bit of a disturbance amongst the general public because their first glimpse of psychedelic therapy, or only glimpse of psychedelic therapy, is ketamine assisted therapy. And that's somewhat tainting their view of what the potentials are if only we had MDMA and psilocybin. Now, of course, Australia made that landmark decision to allow the use of MDMA and psilocybin, and it's the only country that's done it. Um, there are lots of grey areas around the world where retreats and well-being centres, etc., are pertaining to provide MDMA and psilocybin, but strictly speaking, it is still underground.
Still
Australia
seems a
is
bit like a Dallas Buyers Club kind of deal.
it's a very strange situation. This is the thing, Bailey. I get so many people asking me, can I do MDMA therapy? Can I do psilocybin therapy? And they're kind of shocked when I say, well, you can, but it would be underground and breaking the law. Um, Now, there are a few, as I said, there's all sorts of little exceptions around the world and grey areas like Costa Rica and Jamaica and certainly Holland, where you can do truffles therapy with psilocybin. But they're not allowed to call it a medicine. And this is the real distinction between the use of these drugs either recreationally or in a sort of well-being or spiritual or ceremonial context, and the very formal medicine with a capital M that doctors and clinicians use. And Australia is the only place that has that approval for MDMA and psilocybin as a medicine to be used on psychiatric patients with clinical diagnoses. The other grey areas are sort of fudged by them being well-being centres. But yeah, Australia literally is, and it was fantastic coming out to Australia a couple of years ago and working with MMA just as this decision was being made by the Australian government, because Australia, it's fair to say, was sort of in the backwaters of research. It was ten years behind the rest of the world in terms of, I think at the time I came in 23, there were no formal scientific research papers published from Australia at the time. And then suddenly it leapfrogged everyone else all over the world and became the only place where you could get MDMA and psilocybin. So it sort of catapulted Australia to the center of the world stage. Um, Now, when I came in 23, there was just a handful of clinics, and speaking to Peter Hunt of MMA quite recently, they are slowly increasing and there's more and more providers. But the real hope in Australia is that there's going to be 10, 20,000 patients in the next few years who've gone through MDMA and psilocybin, which would just completely blow out of the water everything everyone else is doing around the world, because they've just got that opportunity.
Yeah, because it seems that over here, well, whoever was going to be first was going to have a massive advantage in terms of numbers for research because of how strict it is everywhere else. And
Mm,
whatever reasons that might be is
mm,
a different conversation or further down the line. But
mm.
any research paper that's been done with any kind of scientific validation has come back and said how useful these things are. And it's not just a very specific compound or chemical, it's across the board. The psychedelic genre has
Mm.
seen such amazing results that
Yeah.
what it begs the question is why it's not being picked up anyway, because you've got you mentioned that the gray areas and how it's not strictly medicinal. But what is it technically that makes something strictly medicinal and therefore
Okay, that's a really good
can be
question.
helped?
So this is the interesting subject of medicine drug development. And one of the things that I think maybe a lot of people in the psychedelic community don't appreciate or just don't understand is getting a drug approved as a medicine with a capital M requires jumping through a lot of hoops. And those hoops are exactly the same for paracetamol, penicillin, Viagra, and MDMA. They're just the same hoops. You have to go through this series of preclinical studies, in vitro studies, in vivo studies, animal studies, and then non-clinical populations, phase one, and then clinical populations, and then phase two with nailing down your protocol, and then phase three. You have to do this. And that process is, firstly, very expensive, costing upwards of $100 million. And secondly, very lengthy, 10, 15 years. And this is the same for any new drug. So to get there from the chemist's laboratory to the doctor's prescription pad requires this amount of time. And psychedelics, understandably, for the regulatory authorities, can't leapfrog any of that. They've got to just do all of that. And that's what makes it very strange, though, because usually when you're doing that, if you're coming up with a new antidepressant or a new antipsychotic or something, or a new antibiotic, and you've developed a brand new novel molecule that no one has ever made, you can understand why you need to go through all those processes. What's weird about MDMA, psilocybin, and LSD, they're not new at all. We've had the drugs around for thousands of years, or in the case of psilocybin, and MDMA for, getting on 50 years. So, yet, in the eyes of the regulatory authorities, they're new because they've never gone through these testing. So it is a necessarily long process to go through all that testing. And I think what a lot of the sort of hippies don't realize is they're like, hey man, we've already got these drugs. We don't need to do this testing. It's like, well, you do if you want them to be a medicine with a capital M. You can keep them underground and carry on using them and breaking the law if that's what you choose. And good luck to you. And there's a lot of good underground therapists out there. Don't get me wrong. But if you want it to be official that your GP can prescribe these to little silver-haired old ladies officially, it has to go through that process, and there's no shortcuts. And but the difficult thing about this then, Bailey, is most pharma drug development is carried out by very, very rich pharma companies. They've got, $80 million in the bank. They're quite happy to throw 20 million at some new molecule. And they do it all the time, most of which don't happen. Biotech is a very complex business, and it's 99% loser business. You throw 10 million at this molecule, 10 million at that molecule. Most of them won't work or get anywhere. But if you happen to hit Prozac or Viagra or, some big drug, you're suddenly going to make trillions of dollars. So that's how biotech works. It's a very hit and miss business. And that's why, going back to your question, it's taken so long. It's about the money. If we had $100 million to throw at each of these drugs 20, 30 years ago, they all would be licensed by now. But
But it
the
seems like this
pharma,
is a hit.
it's what?
It, the research that we've had and the experience people have had from these drugs, taken illegally and unprescribed or not, they are a hit. It's
Exactly. But
proven to its.
But that doesn't mean a thing to the regulatory authorities. Doesn't matter how many tens of thousands of anecdotal experiences you tell the regulatory authorities, oh, but it worked on me. They'd say, well, we don't care. We need to see it working on tissues, on monkeys, on dogs, on clinical patients, on volunteers. We need all these different sites. We need all these different results. It has to be a strong effect size. It doesn't mean, you're absolutely right. You'd think that anecdotal experience would drive drug development. But the sad thing is it possibly hinders it. The last thing the drug authority,
I mean, the stereotypes can.
Yeah, the last thing regulatory authorities want is thousands of hippies saying, "Yeah, man, it's great. Approve it." If anything, that puts them off. So there is that argument that the broad recreational or anecdotal use of psychedelics is hindering their development as medicines with a capital M, as opposed to helping them. Um, it's hard to quantify that, but I think maybe what happened with Lycos and MDMA recently, is an example of that. You know, drug development pharmacology is a very boring, dry subject, and most people take no interest in it whatsoever.
But it's
But
the one of the
with
most
psych-
impactful ones that there is.
but whereas with psychedelics, suddenly there's this huge body of people all over the world who've taken this huge interest in pharmacology, um, and not always helpfully when it comes to those
Mm.
companies that are trying to actually get the medicine approved.
Yeah, I can see where the mindset especially now it's been criminalized. When it was criminalized years previously, you've got whole generations who have been drilled into their psyche that these are bad, and just by criminalizing people who have PTSD, who have trying to do anything to get better, it can skew the results for them personally. And I can completely understand how
Yeah.
if you cannot measure, we have not previously had the tools to measure the effects through numbers and science, only by anecdotal evidence, that it's hard to be able to say that, because if it goes wrong, seems like insurance would be a massive
Mm.
liability within that as well.
Yeah. I
Well,
mean,
so
I
where
think,
have
yeah. Sorry.
no, go ahead if you
I was going to
interject
say,
wherever you feel.
what's just sprung to mind then is with psychedelics, but also previously with cannabis. What's emerging now is a new way of doing research. So all pharmacology research is based on these principles of the what's called the gold standard randomized control study. You take a small number of people, it's very expensive. You standardize everything: name, age, sex, gender, other drugs they're on, diagnosis, and then you split them into two groups randomly. One of the groups gets the experimental drug, and the other group gets a placebo that looks identical to the experimental drug. And then you do all exactly the same things to both groups at the end are going to have a positive effect because placebos work, especially in
Very
psychiatry.
powerful, yeah.
But by splitting them into these two randomized groups, at the end of the study, when what's called breaking the blind and you reveal who had what, you can say, okay, even the placebo group did well, but the experimental group did even better. And the only difference between them and the placebo group was they got the drug. Everything else was standardized. Now, that's called a randomized control study, double blind randomized control study. It's the gold standard. Very expensive because you've got to so meticulously look after these two groups. Usually, you'll do 10, 20, or 30 people on a phase two, and it'll cost you $1 million. And
It's a
um,
very small sample size, though, for these kind of things. Very
yeah, well,
small sample
that would be a
size.
phase two. That would be a phase two. When you go to phase three, it gets bigger. So you have to reach this level that is satisfactory for the approval agencies, and it'll be hundreds in the end, like 300 to 600 or something after the end of a phase three. And then you go for approval. Now, arguably that's really scientific. You can say that the change in this experimental group was entirely down to the drug, and we can demonstrate that. Now, there's another way of doing it, and this is called real world data. Um, Now the difference between the point about the standard group, the randomized control study, it's what we call homogeneous data. It's everything is equal. When you have lots of bias in groups, it's called heterogeneous, and it's very messy. But the n number, like you say, is small, 20 or 30 people. So the n number is small. Now, another way of doing it is if you have, 10,000 people that you give medical cannabis to. You measure their sort of depression, anxiety scores before you give them medical cannabis. Then you give them a medical cannabis for a year, and then you measure their depression and anxiety scores after a year. Now, on 10,000 people, now these are not controlled for bias. There are all sorts of different people, names, ages, genders, different medications, different diagnoses, all sorts of messy things. You're not controlling anything. But the number is so big, 10,000, that when you recheck them at a year, you can say, okay, they were doing all sorts of things that might account for these changes. But because of that really big N number, 10,000, it sort of irons out the heterogeneity. And you can say this is the real effect size. So this is a completely different way of doing pharmacology study. You're you're not trying to control them, but when it's such a big number. If you only did that on 30 people, it wouldn't mean anything because there could be all sorts of reasons why one particular person did better. But when you've got that data on 10,000 people, you can really say, yes, this cannabis has improved their lives. So that's one of the things that's interesting about Australia. If we're going to get lots of clinics open offering MDMA and psilocybin, the whole country is essentially undergoing a giant pharmacology study. We're not
Mm.
controlling the bias in labs, but we're going to have so many people who, after a year, have said, I've done MDMA or psilocybin therapy, that if we see positive results, it doesn't matter that they're a heterogeneous population. And that's the value of real world data.
Well, it's hard to see though, especially with something that's just in a sense psychological. That yes, there's loads of other things going on when you say they're heterogeneous and it can be biased towards certain things, but when you've got a mindset shift or something which is really relieving that pressure,
Mm.
that has such a knock-on effect on every single part of your life that you can say that, oh, this could be because of a diet change or a relationship change or a living or a financial change, and it's hard to say that this was strictly down to this. But like you're saying, on A, on a large scale thing, but B, on a simple mindset change that they are now able to think more clearly and be more positive themselves, they're going to be making more active and better choices,
Yeah.
which have nothing to do with the drug chemically, but have
Well,
everything to do with how they're living their life, potentially because of this initial interaction.
so it's a bit of both. The improved mental state as a result of the drug experience, as you're quite right, results in lifestyle changes and better choices, and then that snowballs into full recovery. And as you said, on an individual, n equals 1 or n equals 10, it doesn't mean much. You can't really say it was the drug. But when you got 10,000 people who said, after my course of MDMA therapy, I've now, back with my partner, got my kids back, been promoted at work, happier, not feeling suicidal, whatever, all the various indices of mental health and functioning have improved, then you can really say, it's pretty strong evidence that this was the result of the MDMA treatment or the
Well, even
psilocybin.
anecdotally, though, and I understand the anecdotal, there's a lot of woo woo out there, which is that taints the waters. But it's anecdotally, if there's 9 out of 10 people, or several hundreds of thousand people throughout history have said about so many positive things and how it's impacted their lives, surely that just ignites even more reason to research it and not block that out the way.
I mean, the ignition to research it is undeniable. We've been using psilocybin for thousands of years. We've been using cannabis for thousands of years. We've had MDMA, LSD. The there's a reason why psychedelic research is big and booming because the anecdotal reports themselves drive the development of the research. It's just the research itself then takes time and money. I mean, and a lot of new drug developments come out of anecdotal reports initially. Sometimes a drug is prescribed for one condition, like things like a lot of things like some there's been crossover between antidepressants and antihypertensive. A drug that's developed for hypertension, blood pressure, happens to improve mood. So, and that's come out of anecdotal experiences, or the other way around. Indeed, that's how ketamine came about. Ketamine was an anesthetic, um, being used in the 60s and 70s in human medicine and in veterinary medicine. And it was a very effective anesthetic, but nobody thought of it as an antidepressant. And then one very bright anesthetist and spotted that after giving ketamine anesthesia to patients in surgery, those ones that reported depression before, for a week afterwards, felt better in mood. So that was an anecdotal observation. And the most interesting thing about that anecdote itself was that there are anesthetists out there who are interested in psychiatric symptoms, but apparently there are. So that's how ketamine as an antidepressant was discovered. So, anecdotal experiences driving the desire to do research is not unusual. The difficult thing is then taking it further and getting them relicensed with a new indication. So in the case of ketamine for depression, which S-ketamine has been licensed for. So, yeah, it's just very frustrating, and it is about money. And, you look at groups like MAPS, who have, Rick Doblin deserves a Nobel Prize for what he's done. 40 years of finding funds to get this drug over the line. Almost, 99.99% of all drug development is carried out by mega rich pharma companies who, as I said, have the cash to throw at this molecule or that molecule, knowing that 90% of them won't work, but the one that does, they'll reap back all their R&D costs. So Rick has fastidiously followed that path for MDMA, and it's very, very close now. And psilocybin is close, but we keep having setbacks. And yeah, the whole industry is in a very peculiar position because after all these decades, we still haven't got MDMA and psilocybin over the line, except for
Well,
Australia.
now we're making strides, as in within Australia in particular. What kind of timescale are we looking at here in terms of where we started now? We say we're in what phase are we in now? Was it in
Well,
Australia? And you say the idea being to get these effectively large scale tests and clinics open across the country.
that's a
But
good question.
before that can kind of become accepted by the mainstream as opposed to
Yeah. So where we're at is a very good question. So MDMA finished its phase 3 and made the submission to FDA last year and was turned down. And they now need to redo, I think, two of the phase 3 studies. So they need
what were
to
the
do
reasons they were turned down? Were they true, accurate reasons or
there has been so much written about this and so much discussion about this. The extent to which it was biased or influenced by higher influencers, the extent to which it was intentionally undermined. I've looked at it really closely. I think my personal opinion was that the panel that assessed it initially did not do a good job. They highlighted various reasons why they felt it wasn't appropriate to approve MDMA. One was its addictive potential, which is absolutely
oh,
absurd because we just do.
considering the opioid
It's
crisis
absurd.
across
It's bizarre.
ridiculous.
But I mean, also epidemiologically, as an addiction consultant, I've worked for decades in addictions. You do not get MDMA addiction. It just is not on the radar.
It relieves of addiction more than anything
It
else, doesn't
relieves
it?
addiction. It relieves addiction. You do not get wards and clinics in drug dependency units full of people with ecstasy addiction. Yet it's second only to cocaine, or third, not counting cannabis, as a recreational drug. It's huge, 750,000 doses every weekend in the UK for the last 40 years. Yet you don't get MDMA addiction. We would know about it by now if MDMA was addictive. It is not. So that was one of their reasons. If we give people MDMA therapy, we may turn them into ecstasy addicts. Absurd. And yet that was one of the reasons. Another reason was just the state of euphoria that it produces. I think probably the main reason, and this is complex, is I just don't think the FDA got it. They don't really understand the concept of psychotherapy, drug-assisted psychotherapy. There was like the drug either works or it doesn't, and so MAPS was saying, yeah, but it works in tandem with psychotherapy, and they just didn't get that. And I think what MAPS need to do when they reapply is to play down the psychotherapy element. And
You've been a big proponent of that yourself to try and avoid the historical connotations that come with psychedelics.
yeah, and don't get me wrong, I love the folk at MAPS and I love Rick very much, but I think, and I love Michael and Annie Mithoff, fantastic people who wrote the MAPS MDMA manual, but it's a bit woo in places. And there's things like opening the heart chakra and stepping into the white light, and FDA do not get that sort of language. And ironically, this
It's
is
a
very,
buzzword. It's a
it's what,
buzzword. It's a
yeah,
buzzword. And as soon as they hear it, those defense barriers come straight up and it
terrifies them.
cannot
They have
be
no idea. They have no idea. But the irony of this is if you look at Compass's manuals for Compass Pathways manuals for psilocybin, and psilocybin is obviously being a classic psychedelic, is a far more psychospiritual compound than MDMA. They have very cleverly steered well clear of that. They say
how have
things
they
like
done it?
they say things like we provided supportive therapy for the experience. That's kind of it. They don't talk about people having ego dissolution experiences. The therapists themselves do in their sort of sidelines and their own publications. But Compass Pathways as a company, as far as I understand it, have been very clever to disengage the hippie element from it. And maybe the hippies don't like that, but like you can bring that in later. We've got to get this drug over the line with a board of very boring, straight-laced pharmacology approvers. And they don't want to hear about chakras and energy levels and vibratory particles, and it scares the hell out of them.
I speak to a lot of different people who are in this similar industry and within psychedelics. So I firmly believe that there is an alignment between each of these areas.
Yeah.
It's more of a it's almost just like we're speaking different languages instead. Whereas that, yes, the experience that somebody has said, with as woo as it sounds, that is the visceral feeling and experience that they had. Nothing to say anything about its physical repercussions. However, there's a science behind it, which is why, and then there's also the psychology which can merge them together as to why this is happening and why this is connecting this way.
And as a
And it's
clinician,
that we're speaking such different languages that it's almost like we're just disregarding each other completely.
I know, and I don't think it's helped. Um, but as a clinician, you have to use the language that your patient brings to the table. So I might get one patient who says, oh, that MDMA experience was fantastic, Dr. Ben, and I feel like it's changed my serotonin levels and improved my mood, and it's inhibiting this and it's exciting that. And they want the scientific language. They want to talk about the amygdala and all this sort of thing. You get another patient who says, "Oh, my heart chakra has been opened," and so then we'll talk that language. I had a patient in ketamine therapy, and he said, the reason this worked, Dr. Sessa, is because it's brought me closer to my Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. So I would go, great, well, let's go with that then. So we use that as their measure. And so yeah, it's not the place of clinicians to select a dogmatic approach to how a patient feels they recover. But when it comes to putting papers in front of the FDA for drug development, you got to play the game with the language they use, or they'll just be scared and they won't know what to do with it, which I think is what happened with Lycos.
Well, that's what you see is that it's so top down and almost authoritarian in a sense where they want that black and white cutthroat. What will this give us? What are the repercussions going to be? What are the answers? How can we plan this into our systems? What can we
Yeah.
do with that? There's a lot of conspiracies afloat around saying of how it's being stopped because of the money that can be made from not curing something and just instead treating it. And I don't want to go too much into that because a lot of us already, feel a lot of people suspect that, but I feel that's a lot of frustration being vented as
Mm.
to the only possible reason they could see it not being implemented. Because
I mean, I agree. Let's not go down into conspiracy theories. Let's try and stick with fact where we can. Um, it's I don't even know if it is a conspiracy theory. It's because conspiracy theory implies some kind of mastermind behind it that's kind of insidious and malevolent and organized. I don't think it is that. I don't credit government agencies with enough nous to be that sort of agent. Um,
okay, so
rather,
let me just give you a little something which you may or may not have heard about then before. Do you obviously you know about the peer review system?
for scientific review system, yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
So do you know the who created that peer review system?
Um, I think it didn't emerge over. I mean, Cochrane was behind it, but it emerged over many hundreds of years of scientific research that um
So it was a
paper.
man called Robert Maxwell.
Right, okay, what the
Rob
media tycoon.
Yes, so the media tycoon Robert Maxwell, who was massively involved with controlling the media for political benefit, created this peer review system and got it implemented across universities across the whole of America and whole of the world.
Yeah.
In with those same circles, and he's obviously so many different fraudulent things he's been up to beforehand has been proven and seen that he does tamper with a lot of different systems and has fingers in a lot of pies, so to speak. His
See,
daughter also is Ghislaine Maxwell, Robert Epstein's wife. And that whole idea being that that peer review system was in place so that governments can effectively pick and choose where they want the research to go. And
mm,
therefore, they can pick and choose where they want the money to go and the funding to go. And therefore, that gives them a lot of control over stock markets.
see, I think that that's a conspiracy theory simply because of the
I believe it is a conspiracy theory as well. However,
just because of
you
the
could tell
age
me,
of Maxwell. Yeah, Einstein's papers were peer reviewed. Um, late 19th century papers were. If we look at the idea of peer review in the broadest sense, asking a colleague to look at my experiment and data and try and repeat it and see what they think, getting someone's opinion about your work predates Maxwell by hundreds of years.
Oh
Science,
gosh, of course.
science is about you come up with something, you design an experiment, you carry it out, you come up with some data and an outcome, and then you, unlike, this is why it's separate from religion and faith, where you say, I've now got the answer. What's lovely about science is you come up with an answer and you hope to God that someone's going to tell you you're wrong. And you put it out there
Yes.
and say, I came up with this. So peer review in the broadest sense is something that is at the bedrock of science. It's nothing to
Oh,
do
of
with what
course.
it's the
Of
concept of I
course.
this, what do you think? Oh, well, I didn't get that. I got that. So I think that okay, maybe there's I don't care, but maybe Robert Maxwell had uh, solidifying that into government, into policy or something. But the concept of peer review predates Maxwell by 1,000 years.
Oh, of
Plato
course. It's crucial.
peer review.
It's crucial for any kind of long-standing, useful information and development and progression.
Mm,
I was just bringing that up as a example of where, yes, it is a conspiracy theory.
mm,
However, it's one which you can understand there is a massive financial benefit in deciding where that science goes. Tying that back into the psychedelic medicinal conversation is that there is a there is a large financial incentive to keep things as they are and to benefit from these psychoactive or
mm.
psychological drugs, pharmacological drugs, sorry, which actually don't particularly do much other than numb people in a lot
Yeah,
of regards.
there is. Again, is that a conspiracy or is that? I just think it's apathy. It's apathy and laziness.
Take
Things-
Taking the conspiracy out of it, and even
Yeah,
if it is apathy and laziness, it is an ineffective solution to
yeah.
a worldwide problem.
Because another way of looking at it, talk about the financial benefits of maintaining, maintenance therapy with SSRIs, whatever. Depends which body you're looking at it from. Because if you're a government providing public health care, there is nothing financially beneficial about the current psychiatric system. It costs so much money and it doesn't work very well. You'd think that they would jump upon some newfangled technological treatment like psychedelics that can cut your waiting lists, empty the hospitals, treat people far cheaper than what we're currently doing. So again, where's the conspiracy in that? Because they want to save money. Why would they want to continue to back an expensive, ineffective treatment? Now, you could argue that the pharma companies might want that, but certainly governments wouldn't want that. Not those providing public healthcare, spending billions on ineffective psychiatric treatment. You'd think that they would jump on. Hey, look, we've got this new technology. It's a fraction of the price. It
You
works really well. It'll save you millions. Why are they not? And I think that's a very good question. And I think the answer is they haven't yet, but they will, and it will tip. Um, but
you'd hope so.
it'll,
You'd love to hope so.
yeah. The other thing about this is we have to try really hard not to be messianic. And I think it's too easy to say this is going to transform psychiatric healthcare. We'll never use SSRIs again. There is a place for SSRIs. There's a place for mood stabilizers and antipsychotics and psychiatric admissions and ECT, and all these things have their
Well,
place.
GLP-1s now as well into the mixture.
Other what?
GLP-1s.
What are those?
So like the lose my mind for here. Um, like the fat loss drugs. In the same sense, there's a lot of research going into them with terms of addiction as well.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. So psychedelics will become part of our armory to manage mental illness. Um,
Mm.
but by far, I mean, as a child and adolescent psychiatrist with a deep interest in PTSD and early trauma, by far the best thing we can possibly do for public mental health is provide excellent support for single parents with children under 5. Yeah. We would empty the hospitals and prisons overnight if we could do that. So much of mental disorder is based in early trauma. And by the time people are in their 20s, 30s, 40s, and they've got any psychiatric diagnosis, doesn't matter what, this thing about trauma, if you hurt, humiliate, abuse, maltreat a child into an early stage, it will become ill. It will. Now, it might get anorexia, depression, anxiety, PTSD, alcohol addiction, heroin addiction. It could get any of these things. It doesn't really matter. That end diagnosis is a red herring. what's behind all of those disorders, and this is the strongest effect size in all of psychiatry, is early trauma. And so, in a way, I shouldn't even be a psychiatrist. I should be a social worker or a politician. Really want to improve the mental health of the nation, prevent trauma in the first place. Um, because children who've experienced early trauma are hugely vulnerable to later mental health disorders of some kind, and they're going to get something. And whether they get anorexia nervosa or heroin addiction is almost irrelevant. The issue is you hurt them when they were 5.
Well, I was speaking with Dr. Kenneth Bloom recently, if you know who he is. He was the guy, one of the main founders and one of the main guys who helped to find the gene which is responsible for your amount of dopamine receptors you're born with and are able to develop. And he was talking a lot about the genetic side of things. There's two parts to this gene of how addiction can become a lot more prominent based on the type of genes that you have.
Yeah.
And then also going into the expression of those genes. And the cusp of the matter is, what it kind of boils down to is people who have this certain type of gene statistically are more likely to, in a larger number, statistically, they make up the masses. They are in
Yeah.
that middle part
Yeah.
of that graph. And because of that, those are the people who are also more likely to be able to succumb to such mental illnesses and addictions. He said he's recently come up with something which goes further than just addiction and dopamine receptors. But his most recent papers and studies he's doing, and his team has come up with a way to measure your genes and come up with a test score to how likely you are to succumb to any mental health issue at all
Yeah.
throughout that.
Yeah.
He
And so,
obviously couples a lot of that with the obviously your upbringing, as well as that the nature and nurture debate isn't really a debate. It is, they are both the same thing in a sense.
yeah. And we've spent, the last 100 years in modern science trying to weigh up that nature nurture argument. And
Oh,
the,
I think nurture comes from nature. it's
well,
They
yeah,
express themselves exponentially over time.
there's a huge crossover. And the other thing about, and genetics is massive. It's a huge risk factor to have the difficult genes or the lousy genes. The crossover is that you get a clustering of the poor genes in the difficult areas in society. So all the nice posh kids that live on the top of the hill and have wonderful parents and go to all the posh schools have got superb genes. And all the people living down in the ghetto, surrounded by drug and alcohol misuse and criminality and transgenerational unemployment and child abuse, that's where depression, anxiety, PTSD, addictions, genes cluster. So it is an interaction of the two. Um, you could almost argue from a eugenics point of view, what you should do is get all the nice posh people to mate with all the nice all the ghettos and spread the genes out a bit. Now, of course, we can't do that, but that's why mental health problems are so prevalent. Is it's a double, triple, quadruple whammy in terms of risks. The patient sitting before you with PTSD or anxiety or depression or whatever, they tend to be lower social economic status, surrounded by drug and alcohol misuse, have had a poor childhood, lack of education, lack of poverty, lack of social support, and they got all these lousy genes that for generations have hung around in their families. So
Well,
yeah.
that used to be that class system which we've rightfully tried to as much as we can within actual society to abolish.
Hmm.
Whether it's still there within our own status finding brains is a different matter.
Yeah.
But
It's
it's
not
something that's
gross disparity of equality, isn't there?
mm. Well, it was. So this was where where I want to take it from here is that obviously it seems to be the case that it's a mixture of that nature versus nurture. Everyone kind of gets that idea anyway, and it's people kind of don't understand how exponential these things are. It kind of spirals in a certain direction, and that grows over time. Say from 5 years old or younger, if you take even a degree of change, that can lead to a large degree of difference in the future of whether you're more positively inclined or negatively inclined towards different things.
Yeah.
But what is that process when it comes to mixing psychedelic drugs or medicine, shall we say,
Mm.
compounds, and also that kind of taught therapy or self-guided nature that goes along with that? Because to me, the best way I can come to explain it would be, as you say, when we're younger, we pick up a lot of baggage from our own trauma, and
Mm.
psychedelics, if given that correct self-guiding guidance alongside that, helps us to effectively drop that
Yeah.
baggage to
So that's
re-piece things together in our own way.
it's a great question. And to answer that question, you have to go back to this very cornerstone theory of child development called attachment. So, attachment theory is the idea that the preverbal child is influenced by their environment. And it's during these very early years that they lay down the blueprint for some of the fundamental psychological processes, how they see themselves and how they see the world. So if you love and care for and play with and praise a child, and you tell them that they're great and they're loved and the world is safe and people are good, they will grow up believing all these things. If you hurt and humiliate and abuse and maltreat a child, they will develop a very rigid pattern of self belief. I am useless. I am a failure. People hate me. I'm unlovable. I deserve to be exploited. It's my fault. The world is dangerous. Don't trust anyone. Um, and these beliefs about the self and the world become very stuck and rigid because they are, if you think about it, a positive neuroadaptive survival technique. If you're a 2-year old and every time you hear the front door go, your dad's going to come into the room and hit you, it is an advantage that you learn to jump behind the sofa when you hear that door and be terrified of your dad. You'd be a mug if you walked up to your dad, right, "Hi, dad," every time and you get. So, in some ways, PTSD itself is the sign of a healthy brain. You have learned to be terrified of the world because the world is bloody noxious. Now, so those
Well,
are that's
it seems that times now things move so quickly with technological advancements and different society changes that we adapt too slowly for that. We have evolved from a time when things did not change for centuries at a time. So those things we picked up when we were younger were very hyper specific to our what would be our entire life, the situation our
well,
entire life.
I mean, I'm not thinking about this in terms of societal change over hundreds of years. I'm thinking of an individual's personal experience of childhood. I guess where that comes in is so okay, you're a 5 or 10 year old and you have effectively PTSD symptoms. You're terrified of the world. You're anxious. You're hypervigilant. But you've developed all those things in order to survive. And then you go into teens and you go into adulthood and you're no longer being abused. Yeah. You're in a relatively benign world, which it is relatively benign. It's not that noxious. You're in a queue at the post office. Somebody cuts in front of you and you have a massive panic attack because your brain is still in the hangover of the 5-year old. I'm being abused. I'm being attacked. You're not. And you have a panic attack and you run out of there. And so, in a way, adult PTSD is a hangover of early childhood trauma, which affects you even when you're no longer being attacked. So how does psychedelics come into this? Well, one of the difficulties about this I often think of attachment as a fundamental flaw in the human brain because it assumes that if you're treated like that age 5, you're always going to be treated like that, and the world is full of people like the evil people who treated you like that, when it's not. Wouldn't it be great if, say, age 16, you have this kind of default brain reset button that sort of says, right, whatever your childhood was, even if it was horrible and you were treated mean, the people that did that were wrong. The world is not actually like that. Almost everyone everywhere is really kind and gentle, but they are. You're not going to be attacked. And then you can go forward in life with a nice clean slate. But you don't. You go into life believing everyone is bad, everyone's out to get you, you're going to be hurt. Then you find yourself in maladaptive coping strategies with exploitative people um, to, because you're more comfortable with that brain state. So where do psychedelics come in? It's very, very
So that
difficult.
is almost that button. For a lot of people, I feel psychedelics is that button of
Before we bring in
not a
psychedelics,
reset, but yeah.
Before we bring in psychedelics, let's bring in traditional psychiatric treatment. So you got the patient with depression, anxiety, PTSD. You you give them a drug that's going to treat their overlying symptoms. If they can't sleep, give them a hypnotic. If their mood is low, give them an antidepressant. If their mood goes up and down, give them a mood stabilizer. If they become a bit paranoid, give them an antipsychotic. They're on there or 4 different classes of drugs, all different, none of which are treating the trauma. They're just papering over the symptomatic cracks. And the analogy I use here is if you've got an infection due to a bug, a microorganism, one of the symptoms of an infection is a high temperature, a fever. You can give paracetamol, and that will bring down your fever. Now, it's not going to kill the bug. It's not an antibiotic, paracetamol, but it will make you feel a bit better because you're no longer hot. And that's kind of what we do when we give SSRIs to paper over the cracks of depression and
Well,
anxiety.
this is my issue with that, is that so there's a lot of things coming out because I'm a personal trainer at the same time, qualified personal trainer. And one of the big things they say now is that when something is inflamed, you always used to say, give it ice. It'll help it to heal quicker. It doesn't. It helps you to heal slower. The fact that it's inflamed, the fact that that temperature is rising is what's sending blood to the area to help it to recover faster,
Right.
but it's painful.
Yeah.
And that
Well,
as an
and
analogy to take into
that is
things like paracetamol for fevers, for temperatures,
it is a
and
good analogy. Although I have to admit, when I said this at a lecture about 10 years ago, I had a cell biologist stand up and say, actually, uh, bacterial infections, etc., thrive in a hot temperature. That's why they do it. And by bringing the temperature down, it does have an antibiotic effect, which is kind of interesting. But that's small print. It's not a classic antibiotic. So
I mean,
let's go back
that
to this.
makes a lot of a lot of sense when it comes to something that's external to the body coming in and has evolved for that. But in terms of internal systems which are self-regulated, I
Yeah.
can't see making something feel better, curing, or in fact,
Hmm.
or
Which,
helping you
on
to
the other
actually
hand,
get better.
what's wrong with feeling better? There's a place for symptomatic treatments, like taking a paracetamol for a headache or a high temperature. I mean, why not? I would. If it brings your temperature down and makes you feel a bit less rotten. So anyway, there is a place for that, but it's not curative. It's not going to actually stop it. The only way to cure this is to go right back to this early trauma. So you give them an SSRIs, you make their mood a little bit better. Put them through CBT and other psychotherapies, and they come along and they try and work on their psychological principles, but at some point they hit a brick wall and they just say to the therapist, I don't know, I can't move any further forward because I just know I am an awful bad person. I know it's my fault. I just feel it in my bones. I always have. And no amount of therapy is going to change that. Now, this is where psychedelics come in. Psychedelics are so extraordinarily profound in disrupting our knowns about ourselves for a few brief hours that you come out of the experience saying, wow, I had no idea I was capable of those places. Maybe I'm wrong about other stuff. And the amount of people I've seen coming out of psychotherapy saying, do you know, all my life I've thought I was an awful, terrible loser. And maybe I'm not. Maybe you just get this little chink of realization that the rigidity of these firmly held fixed beliefs about themselves and their narratives that arose from their childhood trauma could possibly be up for grabs. And that is such a major clinical breakthrough for a person who for 20, 30, 40 years has firmly believed in themselves as one way. The possibility that they could be something else is hugely profound. But that's then where the integration comes in. It's not just about taking the drug, it's then working with this newly plastic brain state to really make those changes and use very focused guided psychotherapy to say, right, okay, the possibility is there. You might not be a useless, worthless piece of crap like you've always thought you were. Now, what do we do about that? How do we move forward? So it's not just the drug. The psychotherapy is an essential component.
Yeah, that was something that I found so interesting about it because you see, there's something I always see almost about the stereotypical woo-woo hippie psychedelic adventurer, realm explorer, whatever they want to call themselves nowadays.
Edge walker. Yeah.
Edgewalker. We'll go with that one for today.
That's what someone
Um,
introduced themselves as an edge walker to me the other day.
well,
Yeah.
I was speaking with one a couple of weeks ago, and I was also speaking with somebody who's a neurobiologist, and he was explaining to me that when the brain goes through such sort of traumas or dopamine effects, that things that really sort of send a big a big amount of influence to the brain, we release a lot of serotonin almost instantly. And that serotonin helps us to be and adrenaline at the same time. And that helps us to be hyper aware of what's going on around us. And serotonin, as we already know, is key to actually learning and sinking in information. So when we have all
Mm.
this a large amount of serotonin, and we're looking for things and being hyper aware of connecting things together, we're learning it, and we think that we know it. We think that we're learning something that essentially is not there. So
Yeah,
you've
so
got a
this
lot of
is
people who make these connections in such a spiritual way
yeah.
that they then believe them at their core because they've not had that
Mm.
clinical guidance or that self-guidance at that time.
Yeah, so that's kind of the neurobiology behind attachment, what's happening to the brain when you subject a child to repeated episodes of pain and maltreatment. And yeah, the neurobiology is very, very complex and there's multiple systems involved. But essentially, your brain grows in a way that is a PTSD brain, to put it simply. You have more receptors and activity in the fear parts of the brain and less in the joy and trusting parts of the brain. And these become nailed down as rigid pathways. They become your go-to pathways. So you step out onto the street. I've not got PTSD and I've had a lovely childhood. I'll step out on the street and go, oh, what a lovely day. Look at all those people smiling. A person with a PTSD head with a lifetime of childhood trauma steps out onto the street and immediately their eyes go to the rubbish, the angry dog, noisy cars. We're looking at the same scene. Essentially, to boil it down, repeated noxious traumatic experiences in childhood result in a PTSD type brain in which you become more aware of difficult, painful things than other people. And there's a classic case test for this called the Fearful Faces test, and it's been done so many times in MRI scanners. You show a person a bunch of hundreds of different faces of all sorts of expressions, and the people with trauma and PTSD seem to focus on and pick out the snarling, angry ones, and the people without pick out the happy ones. Or
Wasn't there
lots.
a similar test where they showed neutral faces and
Yeah,
you were
you
more inclined to see it was on a rating of or scale of 1 to 10,
mm,
10 being the most
yeah.
positive, 1 being the most negative. They would
You do
skew
them
them based on
alongside
their own experience.
neutral, a whole range of different faces, and you definitely get people with the history of trauma and PTSD. As I said, this is beneficial to people who are being abused. You would die in your childhood if you didn't dive behind the sofa and become fearful of the people in your life. It's keeping you alive, but the problem is it becomes maladaptive when you go into adulthood and you're no longer being attacked, but you keep thinking you are. And
Well,
so
that's where it seems like it's a flaw because
mm,
we have evolved in that way for a good reason, like you say, but then we become reproductive at around our mid to late teens, and the peak of our physical life in terms of where we would fall in that hierarchical order and mating benefits that come with that in our late 20s.
yeah,
And then
yeah.
further on from that, the longer we've gone along and the more we've evolved, we've just kept on going and we just haven't died. But then these things that have started off from such a young age have just continued to grow exponentially over that time, where they don't just stop. It's kind of like a cycle a cyclical story we're telling ourselves, which becomes stronger and stronger and stronger, regardless of how informative or factual it is based on our surroundings. It's
And it's
worked in the past. It takes so much energy to change that.
It's even more complex than that. People with a trauma history tend to put themselves into further trauma experiences. People who've experienced sexual trauma as children, women, for example, will find themselves in one after another sexually exploitative adult position. They find themselves drifting towards. It's a bit like that phrase, "Better the devil you know," um, which
Is that
again
why that is?
it's
Because I've
hugely maladaptive. People find themselves attracted to the wrong uns because they've always known the wrong uns, and they don't find the kind, gentle, sensitive men's attractive. They like the wrong uns, and then they get hurt by the wrong uns. So you're absolutely right. It's a positive feedback snowball effect that once you've had early trauma, it begets further trauma, and so then you get people in therapy um, and they can't get past that. They can't get past that. And they're not used to, they're scared by a positive attachment. If I said to a patient, look, you're not. You're not a useless, worthless piece of crap. You're a smart, attractive, erudite, intelligent person. You can do really well. Their immediate thought would be, what's his angle here? What's he trying to do? And
Seems
it's
like you're a
like,
salesman.
yeah, it's like, I'm just trying to be positive. Well, they don't like positive. So it's very difficult. But then you do psychedelics and just seeing people, tackle these narratives that they've so rigidly held all their lives. Now, we understand the neurobiology of what's happening with the psychedelics and this concept of neuroplasticity and neuroflexibility, which was initially first really looked at with ketamine, but we've now got data that MDMA and psilocybin and all the psychedelics do the same thing. They, as Robin Carhart Harris called it, you shake the snow globe. You've got this huge, massive connectivity that occurs with psychedelics, where anything can be anything. So all bets are off. All bets are off. Now, in that state, which is inherently chaotic, which is why psychedelics can be very difficult and frightening, classic psychedelics, anything can be anything. You're not tethered like you normally are. But when your tethering is negative, I am bad, I am useless, I am worthless, to untether you completely for a few hours is weird and scary, but at least you're not bad or useless. You're nothing. You're none of who you are. You're all of them. So and then when you come back, this is the really magical bit. You kind of get the choice to, okay, for a few brief hours, I was totally untethered. I didn't have anything. Now I'm coming back. What shall I have now? What shall I hold on to? And what shall I not? What shall I get rid of?
Mm.
I'll hold on to the fact that I'm, a mother or a father and doing this, that, and the other. But that bit about me being completely useless and worthless, I don't think I need that. Now I've seen it disappear and fly off into a galactic sun. Um, so it's this reprogramming, sometimes called rebooting or defragging, which is the skill of what psychedelics are doing neurobiologically and psychologically. The opportunity to rebrand yourself with a new narrative.
I think that you touched on it a little bit earlier, which for me struck incredibly true as soon as you said it, where once, because to me, you only have your own experience and no one can say anything to you that's going to change that experience. But when you've had a very visceral feeling of you are wrong, that I can now see that you can take your own ego or you can separate that from that for even a split second. For me, it gives me that pause.
Yeah.
Ever since my own experiences years ago is giving me that little bit of a pause where I don't have to react to something as I would assume that Bailey would.
Yeah. Yeah.
Gives me a
Absolutely.
little bit of a pause where I can now think of that and then, like you say, because it took me out of that right there in the moment, this is just what reality is. I'd second guess myself, and then whenever I think of how I want things to be and reconstructing things, I would construct them as I am wrong. Almost like the great philosophers would say, like all I know is that I know nothing kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And it is about this kind of stripping away of labels and branding of ourself. And I can remember a very high dose intravenous psilocybin session that I had in an MRI scanner. And I can say this on the record because I've done all of these drugs legally: MDMA, psilocybin, LSD, and DMT, all
What a
legally.
job.
Well, there's not that many doctors who say they've had all of those 5 legally. And so the psilocybin went in, and like I was lying in the scanner in Cardiff, and I was lying there. I was like, right, I am a man, I am a doctor, I'm in Cardiff, I am a father, I am a psychiatrist. And then 5 seconds later, right, I don't know where I am, but I know I'm a doctor. I'm called Ben. I'm in Cardiff. 5 seconds later, right, I don't know who I am, but I know I've got a body and I'm doing something. Then 5 seconds later, because it was very quick,
That disappears.
suddenly I don't have a body, I have no form or self. And then another 5 seconds later, there is no time or space, never has been, nothing has ever existed. So I saw the layers of the onion unpeeling. And you first, the little things go first, like where am I and what's my name? And the big things go a bit later, like I have a body. But eventually it all goes. Now, when they then wheeled me out at the end of it, and it's all over in like 25 minutes or so, um, and I started to feel the layers coming back. Oh, I've got a body. Oh, I'm a man. Oh, I'm Ben, aren't I? Oh yeah, I'm a psychiatrist. what I was suddenly struck with this thought, wow, what an incredible clinical tool. Because I need certain labels. I need to know I'm Ben, I'm a man, I'm a psychiatrist, I have a body. Those are great. Let's keep those labels. They're helpful. But if one of my labels was I'm a useless, worthless piece of crap and everyone hates me and I've always known it since I was 2, do I need that one? Do it's superfluous. It's no more important than the others. Can I pick and choose which I'm going to keep and which I'm going to drop? So I was really struck after that experiment of the clinical value of ego dissolution. That by stripping away everything, you don't even have time, space, gravity, color, anything, but you need most of those things. But what bits do you not need? And that's the bits where you can finally, after 40, 50 years of carrying this in your head, decide to, you can suddenly realize that the rigid narratives that you formed very early in life are not necessary and they're maladaptive and they're causing dysfunction and they're not helping. And you see it in psychedelic patients all the time. And it's amazing to watch when the patient says that and they come out of the experience and they just this look on their face, this sense of a weight lifted off them. You know, this thing I've carried for 40 years. It doesn't have to be that way, does it? And I'm like,
You
no,
almost feel foolish. You almost feel foolish.
yeah,
From my experience, you feel foolish for having believed in it for so long, like you've been pulling a trick on yourself the whole time. And like,
yeah.
I remember coming out of an experience and just thinking, "Oh, I'm a fucking idiot." It's like,
I
Jesus,
mean,
what have I been doing?
it's complicated though as well because there's also intellectual realization and emotional realization. They're slightly different. You can get someone in in non-psychedelic therapy after many years to an intellectual level where they're able to say, right, I realized that what happened to me when I was 6 years old, I was physically and sexually abused. It wasn't my fault. I shouldn't be beating myself up about that. I was an innocent child victim. It wasn't my fault. It was done to me by bad people who were wrong. And I realize all my life I've thought of myself as bad. And I realize now that that's wrong. You know, I'm not. But that's a great intellectual realization that you can get from traditional psychotherapy. But they sort of say, but in my heart, I can say those words.
Mm.
In my heart, I still think I'm bad. And
Yeah,
they
they
have,
kind of fall away when plans hit the fan or when things aren't going your way. You've woken up a bit tired or distressed, and then you kind of instantly just flick straight back to something. You might lash out and say something or have those kind of beliefs.
your brain going back to, hang on a second, no, you are a miserable piece of shit. Don't you forget that. Drops you back into it. And what's great on psychedelics is it's not just intellectually discovering this, which you can do with typical psychotherapy. You actually, for those few brief hours, have the entire feeling that you are different. It's a feeling, it's an emotional. A great anecdote here. I had a patient in MDMA therapy, and she'd been abused, and she was lying there very high, right, sort of like 3 hours into the experience, and she turned to me and she said, "Oh, Dr. Ben, this is so beautiful. This is so lovely. Is this what love feels like?" And I sort of thought for a second, and I thought, this is a transient drug-induced experience. This isn't a noble experience of love. And then before I answered, I stopped myself and I thought, hang on, she feels safe. She feels warm. She feels trusting. She feels secure. She feels contained. And I said, yeah, this is what love feels like. And she went, "Oh my God, I've never felt this before. My whole life, I've only ever felt fear and pain and terror. And now I know what it feels like to have love." And the next day, when we were talking and she would come down off the drug and she was back to normal, I said, do you remember that conversation? And I said, were you just high? And she goes, yeah, I was high, but I know what it feels like. I have a blueprint. I have a foundation that I am capable of love. And I said this to her. I said, the drug didn't give you that love. The drug, what the drug did was uncover all the things that were stopping you from feeling it. That was in you. You have that capacity for love in you. You've just shrouded it with all this trauma. And so that was you can see this attack of her rigid attachment pattern happening in front of my own eyes. That this realization that she could be rebranded, she was capable of love because she actually now knows what it feels like, not just intellectually how to describe it. She knows how it feels, and she can go out and experience that in her relationships in a way she couldn't have done without that drug experience.
Well, that was for me what sparked a massive kind of realization where you don't necessarily have the choice, but you have more of a say in what you want to experience going forward. Because now you know that you're not stuck. You know there's other options. You know what this feels like. You've now got a tangible, well, not well, you've got a very visceral memory of what it felt like at those times.
Yeah,
So now you know it is possible for yourself.
yeah, yeah. You know, it's
Whether
possible.
you can get there, whether you can get there, or you know how to get there, or what you might do to feel that way, or what you might do in your life afterwards is completely different, and how you piece things together. But you know it's possible, which to a lot of people is all they kind of need to be able to think it's possible, and I've been there beforehand. Let's go for it.
Yeah,
Because you get
yeah,
so many people who take these drugs either recreationally or in different settings, and they don't take them ever again. They've had that one time, and that memory is so then lodged and ingrained within them that they don't need that again.
yeah. And it's drugs like psilocybin and LSD are very rarely abused in terms of heavy dependent use. Well, no evidence of physical addiction or anything. Because like you say, you don't need to keep repeating it. It's that classic Alan Watts quote: "Once you've got the message, you can hang up the phone." You don't. How many times enlightened? By definition, it only needs to happen once. But when it comes into clinical practice, repeated courses of psychedelic therapy are perfectly acceptable. And I think this is going back to the very early beginning of our discussion about how this is being understood in the scientific and pharmacological community. There's some people who are critics of psychedelics and say, if it doesn't work straight away, then it's useless. Well, we don't say that
What
with any
drug
other.
does?
We don't
Yeah,
say that
yeah.
with the other part of medicine. If you have a treatment for leukemia and it doesn't work, you do it again. You know. So why should psychedelic therapy have this one hit and you're out sort of like approach? And I think as we get the drugs licensed and approved and used more broadly, especially in Australia, we're going to learn much more about when to offer booster sessions. How many, do you do this once a year? What, twice a year? Once every 2 years? And I think that's absolutely fine that we might repeat the treatment. Why not? It's very low toxicity compared to sitting on long-term maintenance drugs.
Well, this is where I feel like there's a lot of discussion and nuance within the whole field and the whole idea of researching and looking at the results for what they say, because they very rarely will speak for themselves, I believe. And suppose only as brain imaging gets better and better over the years to come that we'll actually even possibly be able to see some of these areas light up in certain patterns and certain rhythms. But because so much of it is what we think of ourselves, and by definition is fiction. It's a story that we tell ourselves, and how is it possible to measure that? And how is it possible to say that a certain dose is going to allow you to uncover all the things that have happened in your life in that order and blah
Mm,
blah 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 blah? It's completely,
yeah.
in
It's,
essence, up to how the person perceives it.
it's a really
That's
good
I
point.
can't see that if we decide to look at testing and going down the normal drug route that we have done with other drugs which have a very clear chemical and biological effect on us, we won't get the same answers. It doesn't work like that. In the same way that you can say, like if I say, how much abuse does it take to give someone anorexia nervosa?
Yeah, yeah.
How many times does a parent have to hit them to
No,
make them
it's a
these
very
give them
good
these
point.
things?
I think yes and no to that. Psychiatry and mental health is a fluffy subject, and it's not as easy as potassium levels in the kidney or whatever. It's not as quantitative as that. Yet there is a quantitativeness to it. Um, for example, well, going to this question of which drug should I use in psychotherapy and at what dose for psychedelics, we're still learning on that. But 125 milligrams of MDMA is pretty reliable at producing a reasonably reliable, not on everyone, but the majority will get a particular effect. 25 milligrams of psilocybin is pretty much the sweet spot dose. Of course, individuals need more or less, and that's why we very closely monitor psychedelic therapy, and we're going to move towards producing a more bespoke pattern of dosing for particular people based on some tester doses and that sort of thing. But
Could the dosing be prescribed by a licensed physician in a clinical way after different tests on maybe personality tests, maybe sessions with a psychiatrist,
yeah,
so they can see, is it possible to see that they may have a certain degree of trauma from the outside
Yeah,
perspective, and that could then affect the dose that may be required or
yeah,
prescribed.
but there's lots of different
Potentially, in
schools.
a distant future, let's hypothetically, obviously.
Yeah, I think, but there's still lots of different schools of thoughts about whether you start on a really small dose or you start on a really big dose. And that emerged in the late 50s, early 60s. These two schools of thought of psycholytic therapy and psychedelic therapy, and we're seeing it borne out today with microdosing. So there's arguments on all sides. I think the most important thing is you just keep the patient at the center of their care plan and you let them drive it. Um, because as soon as you lose them and their trust, you've lost the battle completely. So
Well, that
I
doesn't work for widespread medicine. That's not how that system works. That's not how the
Well,
NHS would ever work, at least with other
we
drugs.
use dose-dependent dosing in all kinds of different medicines, don't we? You change the dose according to the need of the patient. And in terms of going back to what you said about personality testing, yeah, you can like fire all kinds of rafts of personality tests and psychological scales and rating scales on patients. But at the end of the day, it is quite an idiosyncratic and bespoke experience. And you give one person one dose and it blows their mind, and the other one it doesn't touch the size. And we're learning more about genetic dispositions as well as to how people react. But I want to just make a point about which psychedelic for which condition. And one of the things that's happened over the
I was
last
just about to ask that.
yeah, one of the things that's happened over the last sort of 40 years of psychedelic research is a certain pigeonholing. But in my opinion, that pigeonholing is um, just an issue of what studies happen to have been done. So MDMA has had all this PTSD focus, so it's kind of being pushed in that direction. Psilocybin's had lots of anxiety and depression focus, and it's being pushed in that direction. Ketamine's had lots of depression focus. Um, I think all of the psychedelics, whether it's MDMA, ketamine, psilocybin, 5-MeO, DMT, DMT, LSD, they are all, as Stan Groff says, non-specific adjuncts to psychotherapy. So and this ties back to the argument I was making before about how all the diagnoses are all the bloody same as well. They're all the psychiatric diagnoses are non-specific versions of childhood trauma in many cases. So for this reason, any psychedelic would work with any psychiatric condition, pretty much, broadly speaking, putting aside psychosis. Um, so if the underlying problem is trauma that's not being addressed by traditional psychotherapy, and all psychedelics augment psychotherapy, then all psychedelics would work for anything. And I think 10, 15, 20 years down the line, you're going to go into a psychedelic clinic, and whether you've got depression, anxiety, PTSD, etc., you're going to have the whole smorgasbord. Would you like to try 5-MeO? Would you like to try DMT? Would you like to try psilocybin? Do you want to try ketamine? And I don't know how it might work mechanically, but maybe some kind of early initial test doses until you work out the compound that works best for you. And then you have mixed protocols where 1 month you'll do MDMA, the next month you'll do 2CB, and so I think that's what the future pharmacology is going to look like. Now, that presents an enormous problem, like you say, for healthcare industry and for pharmacological approval agencies, because they're not used to that. They're not used to, here's you don't go to the FDA, I've got this new drug that treats leprosy, cholera, high blood pressure, heart disease, and lung cancer. And there's about 10 of them. They all do it. They're like, well, how do we approve that? And so the pharma industry has been driven in this direction that it's one drug for one condition, and you do the studies on that condition, and then you target the drug to that. And that, of course, financially is a great benefit for the pharma industries. A drug that works on everything in psychiatry, and many drugs that work on everything, just blows the mind of our current categorical system of both diagnosis and pharmacological categories. So maybe this is one of the
Like a
impediments.
modern age penicillin.
Yeah, I mean, just yeah, magic elixir, but we're not allowed to say that. So, um, yeah, and
Not
this
if you
is
want approval.
yeah, this is one of the challenges, but also the beauty of it. If we can, like you say, hypothesize this non-regulated world where they're all available and they're all safely used, um, then I think that's what the future's gonna look like. We're not gonna be pigeonholing disorders with psychedelics. We're not even gonna have pigeonhole disorders themselves. I think the whole of psychiatry could be reformed, and we call it trauma-based medicine, psychological trauma-based medicine. And
I mean, that
the
sounds a lot more accurate. Whereas we have a tendency in today's age, especially in a hypersocial world, that people almost take a degree of pleasure from saying that they've got a certain thing, a
Yeah.
specific thing, and
Some
now
patients
part of
like
a group that has this.
And
There's,
patients like that. And when I get a patient that says, "Look, I really want an autism diagnosis. I really want an ADHD diagnosis," I'm happy to help them with that and say, "Yeah, here's the cluster of symptoms. We call this ADHD." And they want that. Others like, "I don't want labels." It's like, okay, well, we won't call it anything then. And I personally, as a clinician, I think that function and dysfunction are better measures of mental health than cognitive symptoms or psychological symptoms. You know, um, it's dysfunction that takes you into the doctor in the first place. It's not psychological rating scales. You go into the GP with your depression or whatever, and you sit down and you go, "My wife has left me, my kids won't talk to me, I've lost my job, you know, I can't eat and I can't sleep." And then they go, "Oh, we call this depression." So it's dysfunction. So when you're working with a patient in therapy, I always say, and I take it, if you're looking at, say, CBT, I'm really fond of the B part, the behavioral part. It's like, I'm not going to sit here and take all this money off you and work with you for a year to turn you into a highly enlightened, lonely person. You know, this isn't about you becoming enlightened and knowing yourself. This is about you getting off your ass, getting a job, finding a partner, be living a life. And so those functional aspects of treatment outcome, I think, are more important than how they feel necessarily. They're a much better measure. When you have a patient come in for a review at 6 or 12 months and they say, "I've been promoted, I've got a new girlfriend, I'm learning to play the guitar." These kind of functional measures are much more impressive as a positive outcome of than, "Oh, I feel better." Because naturally,
definitely,
when you feel better, you can do all this stuff.
it enables you from that, and it kind of seems a bit like the map is not the territory. With
Yeah,
when it comes to yes, people who want to abide by labels or non-labels or whatever, however they want to decide how they process and deal with it. Like I think exactly what you say, unless it has some sort of tangible effect on their life, and that's that.
mm,
What is the point? What
yeah.
was the point for that? And like
I mean,
that was going to be my question about different psychedelic drugs for different modalities and different potential areas of whether we've actually found a benefit for, say, people with anorexia
mm.
may benefit from MDMA, or people with different with depression may benefit from ketamine or whatnot. But
Well,
as you
what
say,
would
that might be where we've directed it so far. However,
mm,
if so, what you're saying is that there's a wide scale and a wide spectrum,
mm.
and any of them will work for any of them.
I think it's moving in
Is
the
it? Is it?
more
Does it
studies.
almost seem like too true? Well, because of all the studies that have been gone into each individual area of mental health issues, is it kind of a case of it seems too good to be true? It seems to be good to be true because so much research has gone into all these different areas individually that it's like the doctor's fallacy, where a doctor is a lot more likely to prescribe something than not prescribe something because they've spent their entire life working on being a doctor and doing all these tests, and
Yeah,
they've committed themselves to it. So they feel almost like a failure if they don't then prescribe something, even if the best action may be to not do something.
yeah. I mean, I
Whereas in this
people.
situation, we've got so many different areas and research and knowledge that has gone into mental health issues that it's almost seems people are reluctant to say this will cure it, because it seems to them, because of the research they've done in that in particular area, too complicated to all of a sudden be resolved from this
Yeah.
one
Well,
magical elixir,
I
for lack of a better term.
present these outcomes in this data, you would not be helping yourself to say this is the cure. That because mental health is there are no cure buttons. Um, it's multifactorial, and you can give someone a ton of Prozac, but if you leave them in the same crummy relationship and crummy job, they're not going to feel better. This is why we have this what we call biopsychosocial approach. You have a biological approach to changing the chemistry in the brain. You have a psychological approach using psychotherapy to help them address fixed narratives from attachment disorder. And then you have a social approach where you help them to get a job and join this club or that club. And you need all three of them to work. If you only use one, you're never going to properly cure the patient. And also, they are ongoing. When do you reach mental health? Have I got mental health yet? How do I know? I mean, I've got friends and family who love me. I'm not in jail. Um, I'm financially secure. I probably have pretty good mental health, you know. So how do you even measure it? But I might not tomorrow if all my friends and family decide to leave. So like, it's not only is it not an on-off switch, but it's a switch that constantly needs to be reviewed to maintain good mental health, just like physical health. When do you reach physical health? You know, peak physical health. You've got to keep eating a
Mm.
diet and keep going to the gym and you know and keep reducing your alcohol or smoking or whatever. So it's and I think one of the dangers of psychedelics and the history of psychedelics in the last 50 to 70 years is this messianic approach. And you can understand where it comes from, because when you take LSD for the first time and it utterly blows your mind, it's a bit like being a sort of born again Christian. You kind of want to run into the streets and tell the world, I have seen the light, you know? And you can understand why people feel that because it's so profound. Um, but it does set up false expectations, and expectation management needs to be taken into account. And you see this in psychedelic patients. You know, you'll have a patient who has psychedelic therapy, and they'll come in the next week and they'll go, "That's it. I'm going to leave my wife. I'm going to leave my job in the city. I'm going to go and live in a yurt in Totnes. Everything's going to change." And you have to say, "Whoa, whoa, slow down, slow down." You know,
Well,
it
that's that serotonin release that makes
yeah,
you. As from that, I got that there's a big difference between understanding something intellectually and then knowing something.
yeah,
Knowing something can be very deceiving because you can know something which is completely wrong. And that
mm,
is perceptive. And it is depending on what you think and what you feel and what your upbringing, blah, 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 everything that goes into what you dictate as knowing something.
yeah,
But because we're in such a state where we've been shocked completely, we are then thrust into this massive serotonin dump, which basically means we
mm,
now feel that we, for a short period of time, have all the answers
yeah.
and know everything. So
Yeah.
like
I'm not talking
there's a
about if they're
self-guide.
in the intoxicated state. This is after they've returned to a normal brain state, and, you know, no longer having, the serotonin. They you know, you can still especially more so with classic psychedelics, you kinda look at your whole life and think everything needs to be changed, and you need to say, "Look, what you need to do is use these realizations you've got to work slowly on a more meaningful life. Don't leave your job in the city, but be a city banker who is vegan and loves nature, you know? Or, you know, so you don't have to be dramatic because that's that sort of massive swing of the pendulum is kind of where you got into problems in the first place. It's too black and white. It's based on these fixed narratives. And and I think one of the going back to our earlier conversation about why is it taking the industry so long, I think that messianic approach, it killed it in the '60s, killed it in the '60s. You know, it wasn't, you know, the scientists were working along quite happily in the late '50s and early '60s with psychedelic therapies, but it was people like Timothy Leary, whose work I love and admire, um, that kind of destroyed it all in a way. The genie was out of the bottle. It suddenly got all tied up with Vietnam and left wing protests, and the government clamped down. If it had stayed boring and conservative and science based, we might the '60s psychedelic revolution for a start may never have happened, which we would miss because there'd be so many great albums that wouldn't have happened. But like, you know, we these in the late '50s, you know, psychedelics were just boring organic psychiatry. A new drug on the block. It came along at the same time as the phenothiazines for psychosis. But then it became this wonderful recreational toy, which was great, and the culture that spurned from that is fantastic. But it killed the research, and that's why in today's world you mentioned this at the beginning. There is this dichotomy between the boring, straight-laced doctors and scientists and the crazy hippies. But it actually makes it a lovely environment in which to work, you know? Um,
A fun one.
it's fun one, you know, and like in the opening chapter in my book that's coming out soon, you know, it sort of says this. It's like it's difficult to walk that stay on the fence between my hippie friends say, "Oh Ben, why are you working with governments and wearing a white coat and writing data?" And my boring doctor friends go, "Why are you working with these crazy hippies, man?" And it's like, you know, the way I see it is I get to go to parties on both sides.
You get to go
But
to the parties and the drinks.
trying to get the narrative, and we touched on this, trying to get the language and the narrative is difficult because as we said, you know, using words like bliss, enlightenment, and clear light don't sit well with the FDA. Yet you do experience all these things. And this is what makes it an interesting subject, that it's scientific. I mean, it's highest level neuroscience of consciousness. It doesn't get a bigger scientific problem than that. This is brain surgery, level of science. Yet,
I think these complexities have helped a lot of people who had been originally afraid of the woo-woo type of dogma. It's helped them get on board with it, whereas like they've now realized things like, oh, okay, this isn't just spiritual hoo-ha.
mm,
This is something
yeah,
that can be studied. And now we've got some, which is all they really wanted, is that they just wanted some hard proof. Some hard proof and some
yeah,
evidence
yeah.
to
And
go along with the dogma.
we're learning about through psychedelics, not just as clinical tools, but as neuroscientific tools. There a lot of data and science is coming out about what is normal consciousness, what is spirituality, what's going on in our brains when we have woo feelings, when we make associations between things. Um, so they are teaching us a lot about the neuroscience of the brain, not just as clinical tools and medicines, which is fascinating. And similar thing happened in the 60s, but we didn't have it was more philosophical approach in the 60s. Psychedelics were sort of pitched against religion. And there was that dichotomy. What we're seeing now with fMRI and neuroimaging is we're learning about states of consciousness physiologically through the use of psychedelics as tools. And it's massively advanced brain science.
This is what excites me the most, and I do a lot of with the conversations that I have is tying those together. Like I said right at the beginning, I firmly believe that it's more of a language issue than anything else. It's just we just don't see eye to eye on the language, and we're
Mm,
thrown off by the different cultures that come with each of them. Whereas, like you say, 50 to 100 years ago, all the mathematicians and scientists were all philosophers and spiritual leaders at the same time. Where now that those philosophers have gone more now into the scientific areas, and we can all start to piece things together for that unified theory.
mm,
And it'd be amazing, but it just seems that a lot of people are so reluctant to sacrifice their own ideas of how they understand it to see things from another person's perspective
mm.
and to see where they align as opposed to where they differ.
Yeah,
Those buzzwords are always going to be there, and it's
yeah.
absolutely criminal how some of the smartest people in the world can't see past their own fallacies and their own connotations of these buzzwords.
Well, it's interesting because it's like I said earlier, there's a fundamental difference between faith and science. Science wants to be proved wrong. Faith and dogma, whether it's Jesus, Buddha, Islam, or crystal healing chakras and energy levels coming from the psychedelic community, there's a rigidity to it. This is your chakra, this is the energy level, these are the entities in the hyperspace DMT space. That is what is happening. And for me, when I hear that, they may as well be talking Catholicism or Islam. You know, and I kind of find that sad because the whole concept about psychedelics is they mess with dogma. And this is maybe, you see this out of a lot of the
Ironic.
psychedelic philosophers. I think the first thing you have to say about the psychedelic state is, I have no idea. At the minute you start trying to pin it down of this is happening, that is happening, it's so subjective. But it's that not knowing which is good. But on the other hand, this is my personal theory on spirituality. Spirituality is a physiologically based psychological reaction that is produced by electrical activity in the temporal lobes. It's kind of sweet when people mistake this for a deity, but they do. And that's very patronizing of me to say that. And I say it intentionally like that in a patronizing way. It's not a deity. It's your bloody brain, just as you don't deify the spleen or the adrenal gland or the small bowel. It's just doing its job. But for some reason, you fall into the illusion that it's real because that's what brains do. But then it brings us back to the question, well, why do we have spirituality? Why is spirituality as a psychological, physiological state been recurring over all generations in all cultures since the beginning of Homo sapiens? And the answer is it must have some kind of human evolutionary advantage, or it would have not been selected for. So we're then in this position that, this is my personal opinion, spirituality is a delusion. It's not real. It's just your brain messing things up. You think you're connected with the leaves and the trees and the planets, and you're not. You're not. You're just a lump of meat kept slightly above room temperature by complex biochemistry. You're here for 86.4 years, then you're eaten by worms. Get over it. But it feels different. It feels that we're part of some wonderful thing. And the really crucial thing is it's really good to have that feeling. Even though it is a delusion, it's really, really good for you. You lead a better, more full human life if you collude with that delusion. If you are hard-nosed and scientific and have no interest in those psychospiritual realms, I don't think you lead such a good life. So we're in this weird paradoxical position as a neuroscientist where you know that spirituality isn't real. It's a real phenomenon. It's a felt phenomenon, but then so is temperature. So yet, if you don't believe in it, you're not going to live such a great life. So you have to collude with a delusion, and that's great. And so then, and psychedelics, and this is the thing that makes me laugh when people talk about psychedelic spirituality. That's an anathema. You just taken a bloody drug. What better you want from an organic basis for an experience than a drug? You weren't feeling spiritual. You take the LSD, you're feeling spiritual. That that just throws completely out the idea that there is a God because you've just induced it organically. So, yet it's good for you. And whether you get that spirituality through prayer, meditation, sitting on a Tibetan mountain, or going to a church or synagogue, or whether you get it from LSD, doesn't matter. It's just good to have it. So it's a weird one. That's my personal take on spirituality. It's good for you, but it's not real. But pretend it is.
Definitely. I mean, I think this is, in terms of an experience, this is all that we have and is all that we, as the person that we are, will ever see and ever know. And I feel that's all we have to guide us with where we go. And I feel the same way, whereas you mentioned that science wants to be toned down and religion and dogma don't want that at all. And that's where they kind of conflict in those areas. I would say, in addition to that, science takes that too far and says that if it's not measurable, it's not real.
Yeah.
Which is where we are guided, because this is my part of my understanding of how we marry these and align these things together, being that we feel things viscerally in a way that is unexplainable to our human knowledge so far. Where we are right now as scientific, we know so much, but we know so little at the same time. But the fact that we all have a gut or intrinsic feeling of certain things, we put woo-woo and spiritual words towards them to explain them in a simple way that everyone can understand. When there is a scientific way that explains it, and it may not resonate as well as we might feel, but science can get there and to explain that at some stage.
Yeah.
But if science at the same time isn't willing to say, because it's only now with quantum mechanics and that we're kind of looking at things slightly differently. And
to mention quantum mechanics, yeah.
I've spoken to a few, yeah.
Measure, we still accept that we accept phenomenon exists just because we can't measure them or quantify them or understand their origin. So I don't know that the statement of science is only interested in things it can measure. I think there's a lot of science which is, well, there's all sorts of ways of measuring things. They're like psychedelic experiences and all these rating scales and mystical experience scales and things. They're incomplete in terms of, like you say, an emotional acceptance and feeling. But we make efforts to categorize.
When I say that they don't like things that aren't measurable, I mean it more so in a way that they don't like things that contradict. And when something is contradictory in the maths behind it, very often they will not be able to, because you can't put it into that unifying theory of everything. That's when it's kind of dismissed.
Yeah.
Whereas when anyone who's had a psychedelic experience where they can feel those layers drifting away, it breeds inconsistencies, incongruencies, and that contradiction with every angle that you take it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's why it splits them in two.
Yeah, and that's why it's powerful for tackling rigidity, because, like we said, those parts of self that you so rigidly held as truth, the psychedelic experiences that teaches you that they don't need to be and they can be tackled, and that's great if you've got a head full of difficult things and you want to get rid of them. If you don't have a head full of difficult things, then when people have, I had a negative DMT experience, again, a legal experience as part of a study, and it totally blew my mind. And I came out of it thinking, nothing is real. We live in a matrix. We're all just part of a computer program. And it took me a long time to really come back to earth, like months, because I would be with my children and I'd be playing with my children and I'd think, oh, but they're not real. They're just computer programs. Like, I don't want them to be bloody computer programs. I want them to be my real children who I love and love me. And it scared me. And it scared me that I'd been shown this true reality and that the other reality I've lived in all this time was not true and was some kind of phony fake machine. I didn't want that. I want to live in the machine. So sometimes
Mm.
too
That
much,
is very Matrix X-esque.
too much realization can be destabilizing. People, it's a bit like the spirituality thing. People like delusions. Maybe real life is a delusion, but I don't care. I like it. I would like to stay deluded if that's the case.
Well,
And
in a sense, it's true. It's very true.
the
It's
classic saying, open your mind, but not so wide that your brain falls out.
I like that. I
Hmm.
like it. It's very true though. It's distinctly true that if the only thing that sets us apart from anything else is that we decipher things. We take a contrast of one thing to another for our own survival. It's a survival mechanism.
Yeah. Yeah.
We group things together so we can process them in a way which helps our survival. We group them
Absolutely.
together and then contrast them from one to another. In essence, there's no difference between this mic in front of me, to the camera, to the light, to anything else that's in this room. There's no physical difference down at the absolute
No,
microscopic level,
no, it's
other
just
than what my brain groups together and sees. However, I'm not going to get into the whole free will versus no free will or illusion of free will
can't live your life,
conversation.
can you? You can't just,
Exactly.
you're high on
Yeah,
acid
you
and you
can't.
step out in front of a bus and you say, it's not a bus, it's just a collection of particles. Great. Well, that collection of particles is going to run you over. As you say, we have to categorize and group things to survive. But going back to the trauma issue, the flaw in this early childhood trauma is that we've categorized things together that aren't necessarily true and they get stuck like that. And then you go into life believing them. And what the psychedelics does is shake them all apart again and allows you to reprogram that, rebrand that.
I feel like you go so far along that journey when you're rebranding and you're growing and piecing things together in a way which is functional to the output that you want.
Yeah.
To that realization is how much of it are you willing to accept? How much of it are you willing to? How far down the rabbit hole do you actually want to go before you decide? Okay, doesn't really matter how much further you realize it is never ending with that kind of exploration. Yes, when you can sort of direct that, because in essence you can blend everything away into nothingness and doesn't exist, or you can be hyper specific and realistic of every single detail. I feel like for me, finding that balance between what is right versus what is, or what I want to believe is right, and that's when I was truly able to kind of relax into a more serene way of living day to day.
Yeah. And it's like we were saying, I think you can come back from the psychedelic experience and cherry pick the bits you want to hold on to. You don't have to go the whole way of, I'm going to live in the white light with no attachments and nothing is real anymore. It's a bit like, I don't know, like the person who becomes a hardcore Buddhist and goes off and lives in a monastery for decades, um, because they want to do the whole hog. Or you can just be a person who has attachments but has Buddhist principles. Or, like I said, you can just be more mindful. So you can cherry pick what you want from the experience. You don't have to throw it all out because that
Mm.
usually doesn't result in a balanced life. Um, so the psychedelics are very, very valuable for allowing you to readdress the salience of issues in your life and reprioritize what's important. So, if you imagine everything, right, this is ketamine's very good at this, at leveling the salience playing field. Um, on If you've been abused as a child, so like this computer, that light, that carpet, they're all little blips on how are they salient to my life? You know, if I've been abused as a child, it'd be like, there's a carpet, little blip, there's a lamp, little blip, here's my child abuse, massive blip, massive peak. When you take ketamine, everything is leveled into total flatness. The fact that that's a lamp, that's a carpet, and I've been abused as a child are all one. It's a sea of flat oneness. There's no salience waiting on anything. It's the most extraordinary experience, and your ego is preserved during it, which is even weirder about ketamine. Um, you then come out of it, and all the salience peaks in troughs come back again. But again, like this reprocessing idea, it's like, okay, so my child abuse is always going to be pretty big because it's going to be more salient than that is a lamp. But does it have to be this big? Can it be this big? So again, it's this chance of having glimpsed the numinous where everything is nothing or nothing is everything. When you come back, can you change the focus you put on certain things? And that's where it can tackle these rigid narratives.
Yeah, it does seem like it's a photo that you're editing, where you can then afterwards you can change the contrast, the saturation, the dark spots, the vignettes around it. It's still the same image,
Yeah.
and it'll always be the same image. But now you can highlight certain things in a way or reduce certain things you're not too fond of
Yeah.
without eliminating them completely.
Yeah. I think that's kind of it.
Awesome. Well,
Hmm.
on that note, Ben, I really appreciate this conversation. I've loved every second of it, and love to have you on again at some point.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Bailey. It's been a great pleasure, and good luck moving forward.
Thank you, and yourself.